ever since Steve Harvey left, this really did become a satanic show.
Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizzeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
Hi, I'm Phil, and you might as well consider me a video game newbie.
Hi, I'm Kate. I've been writing software for over 10 years, but not the fun kind.
And I'm Matt. I'm a librarian, archivist, and game historian and author of the book Gathering of Gamers, a history about modern tabletop gaming and Gen Con.
We're going to continue our look at Patricia Pulling and Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. So just to recap what we covered last time. So we were introduced to the early anxieties over Dungeons and Dragons in the 1980s. We talked about the disappearance of James Dallas Egbert III and how a charismatic and colorful detective named William Deere tried to connect it to D&D. And then we segued that into talking about Patricia Pulling, a Virginia housewife who, following the tragic death of her son Bink in 1982, came to the conclusion, I'm not going to say logical, or at least a very creative conclusion, that during a Dungeons and Dragons session, her son had some kind of death curse or werewolf death curse placed upon her son that caused him to take his own life, which basically became the origin story for Pat to launch a crusade against D&D, arguing that Dungeons & Dragons not just led to things like suicide and violence, but it was also, in her words, a gateway into the occult. I see a hand raised, Phil. What's up?
Well, I mean, let's not write this off entirely. I mean, during the game, did he roll a 1?
You critically... I don't know. You critically died.
He was critically cursed, right? That's in keeping with... Now, you can cut that, Kevin.
Hey, fellow netizens, this is Kevin in the editor's chair, and as though driven by some sort of outside force, at this very moment in the recording, my computer decided to crash, and I thought it was too funny not to keep this in. Also, there's a fun exchange coming up between Phil and Matt that I wanted to keep in. But just if you want to know why I just immediately dropped off for a second, that's the reason why. Anyway, back to the show.
That's what I get for making jokes about rolling a 1.
Yeah, Kevin, you froze.
Yeah, Kevin rolled a 1 of
I
everything.
couldn't tell if it was me, but I see the rest. I see you too.
Matt, can I ask, have you played or seen any of the cutscenes from the new that Warhammer game or the new Doom games?
No, I didn't even know they were making a new Doom. I have seen the videos or whatever they did for Warhammer, but I haven't seen any like actual gameplay footage. Have they released some gameplay footage for it?
Well, as far as the cutscenes, I guess where I was going with that is, despite everything, they really get in depth about satanic adjacent topics.
Yeah, they do.
It's really funny, and it's also kind of, they actually do talk about satanic topics, and it's not a big deal because it's a video game.
Yeah. I mean, the Satanic Panic, although I would say it still exists today, it's not what it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago. But there's still people that it ruffles their feathers and things like that. But I don't know how much you're versed in Warhammer lore, but there's demons and things and hell all over that game. And Kevin would know this better than me, but I'm pretty sure Doom takes place in hell. So yeah, those games are all over that stuff for sure. D&D's gotten back to it a little bit too. There's demons and stuff back in that game, but they took them out for a little while because of this whole Satanic Panic business, trying to appease the naysayers.
Yeah, so I guess we started talking about the demonic and my Zoom crashed.
Hey, you rolled a 1. That's what Phil said.
Yeah, Matt, you're right. The Doom takes in place in hell. I'm glad we're talking about Warhammer because we actually have an episode coming up where we're going to talk a little bit about Warhammer. But yeah, so Pat Pulling, she sets herself up as an occult expert and as particularly someone who's warning people of the negative effects of Dungeons and Dragons as she saw them. And so what we're going to do the next couple of episodes is we're going to talk about what was her war against D&D like, the kinds of audiences that her arguments took root in, but also the people who pushed back against her as we carve our little niche of the Satanic Panic through the lens of Dungeons and Dragons. And so Pat and Bad, they quickly found allies in several contemporary moral activism groups. Perhaps her closest ally was the National Coalition on Television Violence, or NCTV. Is anyone here familiar with NCTV?
No.
I remember it's come across in my research, but it's not something I could say that I'm an expert in or anything like that for sure.
This will be fun then. We've talked about NCTV in passing in the past because they actually are pretty relevant to video games. Skipping ahead after the D&D panic, they pivoted into violent video games. So I've got some fun insights into this particular wheelhouse. So the National Coalition on Television Violence was a media watchdog group founded by an Illinois psychologist named Thomas Radecki. And if that name sounds familiar to longtime listeners, hold on to that. We'll get back to that. As the name suggests, NCTV was primarily fixated on TV violence. Arguably, it corrupted young people and contributed to real-world violence, and a lot of Radecki's work involved watching blocks of television and counting the number of acts of violence he witnessed, then publishing his findings and demanding networks clean up their act before Rubik, the amazing cube, caused another murder. A lot of their thing was this idea that they called instances of violence. They would watch blocks of television and say there were X number of instances of violence, and then put out these big bombastic press releases to various television networks and say cut down that number of violence. And it was everything from cartoons to adult television. And Pat joined NCTV's board of directors, and she and Thomas Radecki often appeared in the same news programs and articles on the alleged hazardous effects of tabletop RPGs, although I've yet to find a news reporter call them out on their very close collaboration. Usually when you saw one, you saw the other. Pulling also cited liberally from Radecki's assertions of the dangerous effects of media violence on children in The Devil's Web and other works. Unsurprisingly, Radecki fixated on combat in D&D, seeing it as another instance of the insidious omnipresence of violence in children's programming, one he felt would eventually lead to violence in real life. I think this is one of the reasons why you see in a lot of the arguments that Bad has and other critics like Bad have, why they fixated on violence is because of this sort of so-called expert in TV violence. So, for example, as Radecki explained in one quotation cited in Pat Pulling's book, The Devil's Web, quote, "There is no doubt in my mind that the game Dungeons and Dragons is causing young men to kill themselves and others. This game is one of nonstop combat and violence. Although I'm sure the people at TSR mean no harm, that is exactly what their games are causing. Based on player interviews and game materials, it is clear to me that this game is desensitizing players to violence and also causing an increased tendency to violent behavior," end quote. What do we think about that?
I'll let Kate and Phil jump in on this first, because I honestly, there's a lot I could say about this. And I honestly think there's some merit to what they're saying, but I think they're fixating on the wrong things. So I'll come back to that in a minute.
Yeah, like this seems like more kind of surface level engagement and not really quite understanding how the game works, but passing some very grand sweeping judgment pronouncements.
From a narrative perspective, I think it follows a basic trope of evil is bad and you should defeat evil. So I'm not exactly sure how that message could be corrupting our youth.
Yeah, well, from my vantage, I mean, so Dungeons and Dragons was developed as a war game. It was originally sold as a war game. It was wholly constructed out of combat and had role playing kind of slapped on top of it. You are correct that there's definitely some narrative in early D&D and 80s D&D, basically when TSR was in charge of, good fighting evil. But that's not necessarily what players did. I mean, I talk a little bit in Gathering of Gamers about how a term you all might have heard about, because I know it's used in video games too, called murder hobos came about. And this is something in Dungeons and Dragons where you basically have players being vagabonds going around murdering things and taking their stuff. And those things weren't always monsters. And even if they were, it's questionable whether they were truly evil or not. But, sometimes they'd raid villages and things too. And I mean, where I think that they were hitting on some things that they may have, if they dug a little deeper below the surface, as Kate put it, that they may have been correct at, was just like, what is the purpose of violence in D&D? Are they answering deeper questions? Like, should orcs and goblins really be evil creatures? Like, are they irredeemable? I mean, this is something that, Tolkien's work faces as well, all these kinds of questions. And if you know anything about D&D in the past 10, 15 years, as it's really become very popular in the mainstream, is people kind of pushing back on the violence in the game. And there's a lot less of it in some circles and a lot more focus on narrative and storytelling. So, I mean, part of it, I think, is just how people want to play the game. But I also do believe that violence was a key component of Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, for sure. 2000s, too. But I think that's when things started getting questioned a little bit more. And not because of Pat Pulling, to be clear, but just because more of what players were seeing and wanting to explore depths more than just orc bad, kill it, kind of going in those veins.
Yeah, I think you see a similar thing happen in video games too. A lot of early games built on violence and games that, come in waves that are very popular. We've talked about Doom in the past. We'll talk about more Doom in the future and how the popularity of Doom really inspired a lot more of the violent first-person shooters. But over time, games became a lot more complicated as it catered to different audiences and games that are more role-playing focused and things like that that helped to push that too. Phil, did you want to jump in on that?
I just wanted to make one point about, games in general. They're all a canvas for whatever agenda you have. Like, is Family Feud a satanic game? No. If Family Feud was hosted by Mephisto, would it be a satanic game? Maybe. Like when he went from behind the desk to go talk to. All right, why don't you tell me about yourselves? We've got the Johnson family here. Johnsons. How many live organs do you eat? I mean, that's what the show would be. That's what all the riffing would be, and then you would just think, well, yeah, I know. Ever since Steve Harvey left, this really did become a satanic show.
Family Feud became a hardcore satanic show so gradually I never even noticed.
I'm trying to think of a category that they would put them. I can't. But what I was going to mention though was like this is a thing that like at one point studied hoarding disorder just as a hobby. Yeah, I watched the TV show. I also read some books about it and stuff too. And among other things, there was the scarcity mindset, the idea of I hold on to this because I may need it later, and that is something that in gaming we're all familiar with in video games in particular, resource hoarding, right? Like, I'm going to hold on to health packs and food and whatever else that can be useful to me. And I was wondering if there were any correlations between those two things. And I personally couldn't find any, at least at the time. And I don't, not that I've been following along a lot lately, but I don't think so. But then you think about it, it's kind of apples and oranges, right? Like, Matt, if I come up to you and say, hey, check out, open my coat pocket, I've got, 30 radishes, and particularly if I've been holding on to them for 6 weeks in real life, you're going to be like, Kate, you good? But if I'm playing a video game and I say, like, I open up my inventory, which happens to be my coat, and I've got 40 radishes or whatever that I've been holding on to forever, that's like, well, that's just smart gaming, right?
Yeah, I always see those jokes about Skyrim still, with someone has like 400 wheels of cheese.
Jesus, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, when you have 400 wheels of cheese in a house that you've hoarded out, the situation changes.
I think what goes along with that too is, and this is something I see a lot in panics over video games, is not just that there's violence, but like the context of that violence. So like there's always the concern over a game is going to be a so-called murder simulator. We've talked about this term in the past, and like there are some games that like there are plenty of games that focus on violence and they're focused on killing. Everything from, Super Mario Brothers to Doom to, Baldur's Gate. But like there's something about you framing that because like, you have other games like, Hatred. Hatred's a really good example. This Hatred was basically just designed, or even Postal, and it was inspired by Postal. Both of those games are designed around the framework of you are just there to kill people, to murder innocent people. And there's been debate over like what that means for violence in those games versus other games. So I think it's not just that, the degree of violence and the nuance of the debate over violence in video games, is also the context of it. And that is something that Pat Pulling and Thomas Rudecki have no interest in.
Yeah.
They're not interested in that. And oh, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to add, I mean, that's true for role-playing games too. I mean, it's kind of what I meant with Dungeons and Dragons. Like, violence is baked into the rules of D&D all the way back to 1974, and even in the newly released 2024 edition, it's still there. Now, they've downplayed it more a little bit, but still, ultimately, if you look at the game, what are most of your stats based on? What are most of the rules based on? They're all heavily oriented on physical or metaphysical combat. Like, it's hard to get away from that. There's a lot of role-playing games that try to get away from that, and they do so successfully. But if you take the violence out of D&D, is it still D&D? I do definitely agree that there's questions about the context of that violence. I mean, to go back to the murder hobos, I mean, the context is let's kill things and take their stuff. Is that a good message we want to send to society or players? Or are we teaching our teenagers who are picking up the game for the first time and playing it? Is that a good life lesson? Or is it just good-natured fun? I don't know. I don't think Pat Pulling was asking those questions, though, as you were just saying. I think she saw whole other things and was going. I think there's kernels of truth in some of the stuff they went after, but I think they went after it way too hard and then for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, and I would argue that Radecki is in this kind of thread too, because like Pulling, Radecki is hardly what I would call an intellectual giant when it came to the targets of his ire. For example, despite the claims he was certain that D&D combat led to violent behavior, he was significantly scant on concrete evidence that this was the case, mostly citing random acts of violence and saying without proof that they must be D&D related, something Pulling did too, where she would kind of point to random acts of violence. That might have been satanic related. It was probably satanic related, or even go so far as say it was definitely satanic related, and then having people call her out and then say, no, there's no evidence of that. The other thing about Radecki is, like, again, this will show you the level of intellectual rigor this University of Illinois affiliated professor had. He also brought in some really dubious sources to back his claims. For example, critics noted that in one NCTV press release on the hazardous of Dungeons and Dragons, Radecki cited Rona Jaffe's book Mazes and Monsters as evidence of the hazardous effects of tabletop role-playing, which we have already covered in this because we know Mazes and Monsters is an actual work of fiction.
And was he presumably actually portraying this as nonfiction, not just like, because I know it was a fictionalized adaptation of loosely based on true events sort of thing. Was he citing it as if it had happened?
Full disclosure, I've seen references to this. I haven't seen the exact press release, but the way critics characterize this, he is citing it as if it actually happened.
Okay.
Kevin, I have a question. Was Pat Pulling also trying to outlaw the movie The Exorcist or the holiday Halloween? Because you would think if she thinks this is some sort of violence and satanic content is something that causes this type of stuff, why Dungeons and Dragons specifically?
Well, she focuses on Dungeons and Dragons specifically because she attributed it to the death of her son. As for larger ones like that, I think that if I were to follow the pattern that she does in books like her book, The Devil's Web, that she would maybe say something along the lines of that this is based on some aspects of real life, that The Exorcist is based on the idea of demonic possession. In the same way, like she would cite elements of Dungeons and Dragons materials like the Monster Manual, like the Dungeon Master's Guide, like the Player's Handbook, and say that they have references to the demonic and seeing that as quote unquote accurate, that they're attributing like real, again, huge air quotes, again, real occult elements to it. I think that's the way she would argue. Although I've never come across anything where she's actually talked about a movie like The Exorcist.
Yeah, but how is D&D the worst manifestation of that in our society? I guess that's my question.
I was going to say, like, if you look at it, like Pat Pulling was fixated on D&D, but like the Satanic Panic wasn't just about D&D. It's the topic of what we're talking about today. It goes back on all sorts of things. I can't remember if Kevin mentioned it last episode or not, but like, I mean, there was a whole thing about a daycare, like sacrificing and eating babies for rituals at the daycare that happened in, I believe it was the 1960s. That was a very famous example. And there were definitely crusades, religious or otherwise, against movies where, I mean, we're right now talking about someone who's against violence on TV. I mean, like this stuff, it just depends on, it's like everyone's got to pick a pet peeve. One person's going to be focused on D&D. One person might be focused on violent movies. Another person might be focused on MTV. I mean, who knows what it is, but everyone's got their own axe to grind, basically.
It's one of those things where it's like you go to any internet comment section these days where somebody could be watching it. I'm going to make something up whole cloth, but based on my own observations, like, right? Like you could post a video of somebody freaking out at Dunkin' Donuts because their coffee was too cold, and people going into the comments ostensibly to talk about the public freakout that they saw, and it always devolves, not always, but it can devolve into their particular pet peeve, right? Like, yeah, like, oh, this is because Gen Z is lazy and doesn't, want to have cold coffee, or this is because I don't know, stuff like that, so it's like, who was talking about that? We were just looking at somebody freaking out on somebody, you know what I mean? Like, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail sort of thing,
To jump off that, but both Kate and Matt are saying is, this was a spectrum in the 1980s. There was a number of different moral anxieties that many of them pointed to some level of, again, quote unquote, occult activity. And it was everything from, concerns over media like Dungeons and Dragons, like, Black Sabbath lyrics, or playing Judas Priest albums backwards. There was a really wild one over the Procter and Gamble logo, which is wild. There's a really great episode of The Dollop on it that they claimed that there was occult messages in the Procter & Gamble logo. Skipping ahead, largely those were being pushed by people who worked at Amway as a way of discrediting Procter & Gamble products, and Amway actually had to pay out a big settlement to Procter & Gamble in the 90s about that, but that's a whole nother story. And then there were more more severe, more scary, more dark aspects of this, like the one that Matt referenced. In 1983, there was a concerns over this preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, called the McMartin Preschool, where people started accusing the proprietors of it of not just, sexually abusing children, but like engaging in occult satanic rituals, making kids fly through the air, killing babies and flushing them down toilets, or sending people through like underground tunnels that never manifested. And all of this led to the longest and most expensive trial in American history, one that is largely viewed as it was a moral panic that had no basis. The trial was eventually dropped. I mean, people did go to jail for things that turned out to be not real. So there were a lot of these aspects of it, and you could argue that there's still elements of it that exist today. Like, this is where we get QAnon kind of stuff. This is where a lot of the arguments of QAnon are that
Pizzagate, no?
Well, Pizzagate was part of QAnon, yeah.
Right, I know, but like that's a very
Pizzagate was an element of that.
Example.
Where you have these people that are claiming that, people are harvesting children for blood or for adrenochrome or whatever, and like people who argue that they're literal demons. Like there is a continuity that goes from this stuff in the 80s, part of which went to D&D to more recent stuff. So it's all to say, going back to your question, Phil, is like, it's kind of part of that. It's part of a larger system of that. And Pat Pulling and Tom Radecki fit in it. Radecki's not really interested in the cult element for all of his faults. And we'll talk about a lot of Tom Radecki's faults later on. He is an academic and he doesn't really talk about occult rituals. He's more concerned about violence. Pulling is interested both in violence and the occult. So that's where this all fits in here. And so going back to Radecki and NCTV, that's one ally of Pulling. There's another notable ally, a convenient ally of Pulling. That's Mary Elizabeth Gore, better known as Tipper. Anyone know Tipper Gore?
Oh, yeah. I'm pretty sure I know exactly what we're going to talk about here. And I think I wrote a paper against her crusade against video game violence when I was in middle school. So, yes.
Wait, wasn't she the woman who had a problem with Twisted Sister? I think we covered that on this podcast, right?
I don't know if we covered it here, but yeah, she definitely had the issue with. So Tipper Gore is, she's was at the time the wife of Al Gore. Al Gore at the time was a U.S. Senator from Tennessee. He later became vice president under Bill Clinton. He ran for president in 2000. We're not going to get into it. Some argue he may have actually won the 2000 election, but we're not going to talk about that. But Tipper Gore, she was a moral crusader in the 80s. Her big thing was basically where Pat Pulling is saying Dungeons and Dragons cause violence and interest in the occult. Tipper, she basically did that with music, particularly, popular music, metal music. Eventually, this culminated in a September 19th, 1985 congressional hearing on the alleged negative influences of heavy metal and other music in general that eventually led to the creation of the parental advisory label that you can still see on music now. This is a total aside, but the congressional hearing is really fascinating. You get to hear really interesting testimonies by Dee Snider of Twisted Sister and Frank Zappa. Zappa has a really, really fun takedown of Tipper Gore. But anyway, she and Pat are pretty tight. In her 1987 book, Raising PG Kids in an X-Rated Society, Gore devoted an entire chapter to how the likes of Iron Maiden, Slayer, and Black Sabbath tell our kids that animal manipulation and human sacrifice to Dark Lord, they're pretty cool, actually. And she cited Pulling's work on Dungeons and Dragons as another insidious attempt to sell nihilism, violence, and crime to our kids. And Gore even provided a positive testimonial of Pulling that appeared on the back cover of The Devil's Web. That's Pat Pulling's book. Fun random fact, Al and Tipper Gore's daughter ended up being a writer for Futurama.
Wow.
Yeah.
And Al Gore was on Futurama as a voice actor.
That's probably how they got him.
Oh, was she there when because it was an early episode.
Yeah, she was a writer at the time.
I remember it was a big deal when he played himself, when he was on the same episode as Gary Gygax, fun fact, who also played himself. I didn't realize that she was on for that long. Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, random fact. She wrote a couple of episodes of that show. Anyway, so Pat Pulling also, in addition to allying with folks like Tom Radecki and Tipper Gore, she also took what I like to call the Dave Grossman route. And this is for you, Matt. Dave Grossman is a one of these people who is really influential in the video games cause violence. He's probably the guy who gave us the term murder simulator.
Yeah, because you didn't have to do 14 episodes on the guy.
We did a 14-part series on this asshole.
Oh, well, I can't wait to go check out the backlog.
Please do. Watch me lose my patience. Yes.
So yeah, she took kind of the Grossman route, which is basically she set herself up as a self-proclaimed expert and parlayed that alleged experience into a potentially lucrative career as a police trainer and motivational speaker. In 1987, she became a certified private investigator in the Commonwealth of Virginia and started calling herself an expert in the occult because apparently you can just do that. If no one calls you on it, you can just say you're an expert in things. So I wonder what would you all pretend to be an expert in if you had to start like training police? Or I guess talking anywhere. It doesn't have to be police. So, like, if you were to do the talk circuit or whatever, what would your pretend expertise be?
Should we each pick our audience first, like who we think we could most easily manipulate, or should we say what would we talk to the police about? Because those are two different ones.
We could do that. The police are, given what I've researched, the police are very highly suggestible.
So I have an answer. Kevin, I would have said I would have pretended to be a Pulitzer Prize nominee, but we don't have to. I'm just saying. Just saying, Kevin.
Two-time Pulitzer Prize nominee.
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer to this one because I feel like if there's something I want to be an expert on, I do what I can to do it, short of actually getting like a PhD in the topic. I mean, I've spent years now learning about Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop games. I went down the rabbit hole of beekeeping for about 15 years of my life, becoming an expert on bees. Like, man, I don't know if I could fake being an expert. That just feels too dirty to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I think about like it's the same thing. I would not feel comfortable intentionally pretending to be an expert in something. And frankly, my imposter syndrome is too strong. Like I don't think I could even force myself to if I needed to. Like I can study something for a very long time and still feel like I am not good enough at it. But if there was something that I would want to try to become enough of an expert in to speak to the cops about, it would probably be something like de-escalation and disarming techniques.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think there's a big issue of like, if you have standards, it's hard to basically pretend to be an expert. We've talked about people on the show that I would argue don't have that problem. But yeah, so Pat Pulling, basically for the rest of the decade, Pulling hosted training seminars on alleged cult crime and even acted as a huge air quotes expert witness on murder cases where she argued that young people were being conditioned to kill in service of the devil himself, thanks to his accolades at tactical studies rules. And going along with this, she also made numerous television appearances and sat for newspaper interviews where reporters, for the most part, uncritically broadcast her ideas of the cultish power of the Dungeon Master to millions of viewers and readers across the country. And in 1989, with the help of a freelance writer named Kathy Cawthon, she published her manifesto against the horrific game where you call upon Satan's powers through polyhedral dice and graph paper, appropriately titled The Devil's Web, Who is Stalking Your Children for Satan. Because, if you're gonna be a proper grifter, and I feel pretty confident calling Pat Pulling a grifter at this point, you need a book that no one is gonna read that reinforces their beliefs. It's something I've been playing around with a term I'm calling a pointing book, which is basically what I think of like, you have a preconceived belief, and someone has written a book, it may be a terrible book. It's a book that's basically not designed to be read. It's a book that's designed to be referenced, with the hope that no one will ever read it, basically giving you the impression that this is actual proof of the thing that's there. On Killing, Dave Grossman's book, is a great example of a pointing book. So Pat Pulling becoming a private investigator. As an aside, regarding Pat's alleged expertise in this, I feel in this context it's worth mentioning here that at the time, all it took to become a certified private investigator in Virginia was to take a 42 to 48 hour course. The difference in time depending on whether the person had received firearms training, which Pat of course did. She got her firearms training. And to pass a test. And I'm somehow reminded of the fact that this is real, I currently possess a boating license despite never ever piloting a boat in my life.
So in the gonzo journalism tradition of this podcast, should we, number one, add that we're all experts in the occult? And number two, should we all become private investigators?
Right there. Look at that.
Yeah.
Wow. That does say boat.
I did it for work.
It was a one-day course, indoors, tests.
Marine safety course, yeah.
No time on a boat.
No time on a boat.
Fascinating.
But yeah, so Pat and her private investigator expertise. Among the materials she taught in her courses were identifying the telltale signs that someone might be ensnared in a satanic web. And she offered questionnaires for parents and law enforcement officers to ask two young people to deduce their occult extracurricular activities. For example, watching fantasy or sci-fi movies or reading related books for potential red flags that someone might be, seduced by the occult. And for one notable example, Pat encouraged interrogators of the alleged Satanists to inquire what they were reading a very specific book, the Necronomicon. Anyone familiar with the Necronomicon?
I don't know if I want to spoil it or not, but I know it's not a real book. It's from, if I remember, it's from Lovecraft, right? Is that right? Early 20th century author. Yeah, pretty sure to make the Cthulhu mythos more authentic in a way.
I thought it was from Evil Dead.
Well, it's from that too.
Yeah, it's roped in,
But,
yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, the Necronomicon. This is one of my favorite parts of this research, by the way, looking into the Necronomicon. So
But I guess, Kevin, to your question, it's not a book that anyone thinks was really written ever. Not, it's not like the Bible or something, like where it's like there is a book that exists that people can read that is considered a book. It's like the Necronomicon is a fictional work of fiction. It is a pretend book. It's like a movie within a movie, right?
hold on to that. You're spoiling a little bit of my fun, but yes, yeah, skipping it. It's not a real book, but yeah. So, as prominent expert Ashley J. Williams described the book in 1992, quote,
Necronomicon Ex Mortis, the Book of the Dead. Bound in human flesh and inked in blood, this ancient Sumerian text contained bizarre burial rites, funerary incantations, and demon resurrection passages. It was never meant for the world of the living.
According to a 1927 historical account, the nearly 900-page book was composed in the Middle Ages by Abdul al-Hazred, known also as the Mad Arab. Here's a review of an English translation of the Necronomicon that appeared in the September the 12th, 1935 edition of the Connecticut-based Brantford Review and East Haven News. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in the chat if someone wants to read this.
This book was not intended for sale to the public. It was printed chiefly for purchase by those students of the occult who found it necessary to consult this work in their researches. It purports to be the account of the spheres of the occult and their dealing with mankind from the dawn of history. It shows very clearly the deranged mind of the writer, who was so convinced he received these facts from supernatural sources. Curiously enough, it does leave a feeling of some truth in the reviewer's mind.
Supposedly, to read this evil book was to go mad. And the reviewer noted the English version was severely abridged, with the book's translator, quote, having omitted whole chapters for safety's sake, end quote. However, the state of the translator's mind after completing such a task, we may never know. Because, as we've all covered, the Necronomicon is not a real book. However, that doesn't stop it for having a really fascinating history. This was an awesome rabbit hole. I had so much fun reading about this. There's an article I'm going to put in the notes that does a really great history. This guy, Joseph Laycock, who also wrote a whole book on the Satanic Panic called Dangerous Games, did an article on the cultural history of the Necronomicon. But the Necronomicon, as you mentioned, Matt, was the invention of noted cosmic horror writer / problematic fave H.P. Lovecraft, who first mentioned the book in his short story The Hound, which appeared in the February 1927 edition of the fantasy horror magazine Weird Tales. The book made subsequent appearances in roughly a dozen other Lovecraft stories, including Out of the Eons, The Dreams in the Witch House, and The Dunwich Horror, and became a key component of what is known as the Cthulhu mythos. And of course, in later tabletop role-playing games, there of course was Call of Cthulhu, which was built out of this. Fun fact, one of the guys who worked on Doom also developed Call of Cthulhu. Sandy Peterson, I think his name was.
I don't know if you want to keep this in the episode, but Sandy Peterson is still in the RPG world, and he is a problematic person.
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. I'll look into that now. However, what's interesting about Necronomicon is Lovecraft saw more in the Necronomicon than just a spooky tome to add color to his stories of supernatural evils beyond the pale of human perception. He tried to give the book a viral life beyond his own work. Following its introduction, Lovecraft encouraged other Weird Tales authors to include the Necronomicon in their stories to give the book the illusion that it was an actual document which he and his fellow writers were referencing as a piece of shared common knowledge, what Lovecraft described in his letters as, quote, synthetic fiction, end quote, rather than Lovecraft's literary invention. So he wanted to have his buddies write about this so if people are referencing in a lot of places, they thought maybe people would think it was real. He even penned a history of the Necronomicon in 1927, complete with made-up quotations from equally made-up sources, documenting the wretched book's illustrious, albeit also equally made-up history. And Lovecraft's friends, colleagues, and fans quickly bought into the bit and started inserting references to the Necronomicon beyond the pages of fiction and in the real world. For example, Donald A. Wilhelm submitted a totally real review of the totally fake book that appeared in the September 12th, 1935 edition of the Connecticut-based Brantford Review and East Haven News, which listeners might recall was the passage that you just read, Phil. That was part of a fake review for this book.
Awesome.
Acolytes of the Necronomicon spread its infamy well after Lovecraft's death in 1937. And so this comes from a really great article from 2019 by Joseph Laycock called How the Necronomicon Became Real. Since Phil read the last one, Kate, I'll have you read this one.
Okay. As early as the 1930s, Donald A. Volheim, founder of DAW Books, submitted a review of the Necronomicon to a small-town Connecticut newspaper. Phony ads were placed in newspapers and book catalogs, and phony index cards were snuck into library catalogs at Yale and at the University of California. One hoaxer even constructed a fake Necronomicon that was displayed in a glass case in Brown University's library where the bulk of Lovecraft's letters were archived. These hoaxes were a natural development of Lovecraft's attempts to create verisimilitude for his stories, although the hoaxers apparently lacked Lovecraft's guilt over sowing confusion.
Yeah, so a bunch of people who are fans of Lovecraft started putting fake versions of it in a lot of places, like fake card catalog entries at libraries.
I'm sorry. Isn't it supposedly bound in human skin? Like if you're really following along at home?
And apparently it was on display at Brown.
Bound in human skin?
Has anyone checked the Mutter Museum? Because, if it's going to be anywhere, it's going to be there.
Whose skin? Look, I'm sure Brown has a special collections department and they're going to check out, is this book bound in human skin as expected? Or no, this is just some, this is a paperback. Okay.
As someone who used to work at a site that had the largest collection of anthropodermic books in North America, that is not as uncommon as you'd think. Anthropodermic is a fun term for books bound in human skin.
Yeah, no, that being said, as a person who works at an institution that, look, I haven't checked, but probably has some of anthropodermic books, if there's a book that you expect, if this is authentic, would be anthropodermic, we're going to check that before we put it in the case and say, look, this is it.
Yeah. But yeah, so they kept claiming that there were these fake copies of it everywhere, which I just find very funny.
Okay, wait, no, you didn't answer my question. What was it bound in if not human skin?
As far as I know, I think the reference to it being bound in human skin is from Evil Dead, but I don't know.
That's upsetting. That was what I liked the most about it.
If it's on display in an exhibit case, it's not out of the ordinary that it could be bound in human skin.
Mostly I wanted to know what the one that was under glass at Brown shown to the public, what it was bound in. I'm assuming skin.
I tried to look this up and I could not find anything. But if there's a Brown librarian listening, feel free to message me, scandalsgamespodcast@gmail.com. So yeah, this obsession over the Necronomicon carried over into the 1970s, when several groups of sci-fi and fantasy nerds composed their own editions of Abdul al-Azared's demonic tome. These included the 1973 De Camp Scyther's version, which was written in Duriak, which is a fake language designed to look like Arabic, which had repeating text every few pages. They basically made up language and wrote about 4 pages of text for it and just repeated it a bunch of times in this book and called that the Necronomicon. There was also the 1978 Hay version, published explicitly as a tribute to H.P. Lovecraft, which included a lengthy introduction which had a fake history of the Necronomicon that documented how Lovecraft learned of the wretched book thanks to his father, who was apparently a part of an occult branch of the Freemasons. However, when Pulling asked investigators to look out for readers of the Necronomicon in their occult searches, she was likely referring to the Simon Necronomicon, which was originally published as a limited run of appropriately 6 666 leather-bound copies in 1977. Don't know if they were bound in human skin, but 666 leather-bound copies of this book, followed by a paperback release by Avon Books in 1980. So you could own a paperback of the Necronomicon even to this day.
Wait, I'm sorry. Avon is in like Avon? Avon?
No, I think it's just a coincidence the names are the same.
Okay, all
This
right.
is like I believe this is like a smaller like novelty
Okay,
press.
okay. Carry on. I'm sorry.
What's really fun though about the Simon Necronomicon is that like the others, it was obviously a joke. However, what's funnier about this one is that the author, who's known simply as Simon, although critics and fans argue this is likely the writer Peter Levenda, wrote a follow-up book in 2006 to the Necronomicon called Dead Names, The Dark History of the Necronomicon, where Simon made lengthy arguments refuting the accusations that the book was fake in a downright impressive long-term commitment to the bit.
It just occurred to me that an incredibly diabolical thing to do would be to somehow convince people that an encoded version of the Necronomicon was the Voynich manuscript, which is, a manuscript where nobody knows like what it says or where it's from. So if you tied those two things together, it would now just be impossible to convince people that the Necronomicon actually was fiction and did not exist, because there's something out there that you cannot disprove is not the Necronomicon.
I mean, it's all you can't prove a negative. You can't say that it doesn't exist because, like, there's no way of definitively proving that it doesn't exist aside from the fact of all the evidence that says it doesn't exist. I'm sure there's a corner of the internet that thinks that Necronomicon is real.
Yeah, cargo shipment of those Avon books fell off the Bermuda Triangle.
I feel like I knew somebody at one point in grad school who had a copy of the Simon Necronomicon. I feel like I remember someone showing to me. I never remember looking into it, but like having the other thing about the thing that also in Laycock's book he points out, or article he points out, is very challenging about doing a gag version of the Necronomicon is canonically, according to Lovecraft's references to it in his works, the Necronomicon is over 800 pages. That's a lot of work for a joke.
Well, I mean, it's like any other fictional work of fiction. That is to say, like a fictional work within a work of fiction, right? Like there are things like this where it's like that's the idea of whatever is happening, and any attempt to actually create it is just kind of less than whatever your mind can conjure up, right?
Yeah, it's like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You can never make a full book that's as fun as the idea of it referenced in atoms,
Yeah, or there's I'm looking it up right now. So in the Showtime series Masters of Horror, there was an episode called Cigarette Burns, directed by John Carpenter, about this fictional horror movie called L'Absolu Fin du Monde, which was allegedly screened, and a bunch of people went crazy and butchered each other in the theater. That's not a real movie, obviously. And then in recent memory, Ryan Murphy did one in American Horror Stories, the anthology series, where it was a similar concept of a movie called Rabbit Run, where same thing, a bunch of people saw the movie and went insane and butchered each other. If you say that either of those movies really exist in real life, and then you try to make real versions of them, you could watch those real versions of those fake movies and go like, well, I didn't go insane. I didn't kill anyone. It's like, and you know what I mean? It's like, yeah, this isn't real. This doesn't happen. You're not going to read something like this and get possessed. You're not going to watch a movie like this and get possessed. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And one thing Laycock talks about is that the way that the idea of the Necronomicon became a very powerful message for different audiences, that it became fun for people in the counterculture to reference. It was fun for horror nerds to reference. But on the other side of it too, it became a symbol of all the evil that occult, police and, so-called experts like Pulling were claiming they were fighting. There was no point for them in reading a Necronomicon because they're like, this is an evil book. This is a powerful book. I'm not going to read this, but my kids might be reading this. Oh my God.
And I just to kind of like, if you actually enjoyed the concept of that, like, hey, the Necronomicon, or hey, one of these evil movies or something, if you like, I enjoy that concept and I want to see what it might be like, it's always going to be disappointing to you to experience a real life adaptation because that doesn't exist. Again, you can't prove a negative, as you say. And then the people who just are pointing at this as the root of all evil, well, I'm not going to watch that. I'm not going to read that. I'm not going to seek that out, right?
And the greatest instrument of horror is the imagination. You reference these things and your mind fills in the gaps. So people who didn't find it quite so funny were anti-satanic cops and investigators like Pat, who interpreted the book as a literal evil spell book with the power to summon demons and, I don't know, make your kids start swearing or wearing black or something. And despite the dubiousness of her claims, Pulling's ideas resonated with several influential groups. I'll kind of go through them real fast. So, for example, she gained a lot of traction with law enforcement officials who were either deeply incurious or, thanks to Pat's teachings, had now suddenly found a new excuse to request a whole bunch of expensive new gear so they could brutalize the devil and maybe a few minority groups while they were at it.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but like sometimes it's where politically the focus is. So regardless of where resources are necessary or anybody maybe considers resources to be needed, it's like the focus is on this, right? Like after September 11th, the focus in the US government was on anti-terrorism, right? So everything's going to go toward anti-terrorism at that point. Or not everything, but much money could easily be allocated for that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's a clear vested interest in riling up taxpayers over the alleged threats that they can then get more funding to fight.
Yeah.
And they would often create like tenuous connections between so-called evidence found at a crime scene and then assert that they were part of some sort of larger conspiracy that they can then claim was real that they needed to fight. It also, as with fears over gangs, it creates a justification for police to then target non-conforming people under the auspices that they might also be Satanists in addition to being, young or non-straight or non-white. It becomes convenient for them.
I would be interested to see how this affected the punk scene at the time too. Just because in general punks, right? Like, Kev, do you have any information on that?
I don't. I'm sure that there was some impact. I'm sure that like you could see in Laycock's article in the Necronomicon, you see how like these, outsider groups, non-conforming groups embrace these kinds of things because they know it riles up the normies. I could see on the one hand punk rock embracing this kind of stuff, and on the other hand, like people like the police saying that this is why we need to crack down on punks. It also gained a lot of play among evangelical Christians, not much a shock there, who were an ideal audience for her message because, for one, they were a group most likely to believe the devil was a literal figure whom they needed to fight on Earth. And on top of that, Pulling's assertions of the alleged appeal of Satanism among young people allowed Christian audiences to further attribute any behavior that didn't fit into their specific view of how the world should be run as not only deviant but demonic. So it's convenient for them too. So for example, does your child think that maybe they're gay or they're trans? Well, that's just the devil in them manifested through an evil dungeon master. Or, Sally sassing you too much. Well, it's obviously because she accepted Satan as her personal dark lord and savior through all those nasty Black Sabbath lyrics. This fit Pulling into a larger milieu of so-called satanic experts, usually either self-proclaimed cult experts like Pat or alleged former members of satanic cults who conducted speaking tours and sold books, catered to fundamentalist Christian audiences. Matt, I don't know if you came across in your research the book The Satan Seller.
I did. I have a copy of it, but I am sad to say I have not read it.
I haven't read it, but I've read a bunch about the guy who did write it. And the more interesting story about The Satan Seller is the research that people looked into this guy, Mike Warnke, about how he was lying. He claimed he was, for the benefit of our listeners, he claimed that he was a high priest in a massive satanic cult and that he left it and he became an evangelical speaker. And there was a big article, I want to say it was in the Christian Science Monitor, I think it was, in the early 1990s, they did an expose on him that interviewed like tons of people who knew him growing up. And they basically said all the stuff he said were lies, that he was making up all of it. Didn't stop him from still continuing to do speaking engagements and sell books and all that stuff. But yeah, of course, another notable example in this regard is, of course, the infamous book Michelle Remembers. I don't know if you come across that one too.
No, that one I'm not familiar with.
So I'll be really brief about this. Michelle Remembers. It was a book that came out in 1980. It was co-authored by a woman named Michelle Smith, who was a patient for a Canadian psychiatrist named Lawrence Padser. And this was sort of the first a popular example of repressed memories. And he claimed through hours upon hours of hypnotherapy and psychiatric evaluation that she revealed to him that she had actually been part of a satanic cult, that she was groomed as the Antichrist, and eventually she escaped. And again, like with Warnke's book, her family came and said, this did not happen. This wasn't true. There's a lot of issues that Michelle Remembers, but it did gain a lot of resonance in evangelical audiences like the Satan Seller did. It's also not the least of which is Patzer went through a lot of scrutiny in terms of his ethics, not the least of which was the fact that he eventually married Michelle Smith. Really problematic, this relationship. But all this is to say that Pat's part of this larger milieu of these kinds of people that were largely marketing towards towards not just police, like in the case of, occult experts, but also were targeting specifically evangelical Christians. There was quite a market for this at the time. And The Devil's Web is a case in point in this. And we can see where Pulling's anti-D&D screed fits into the larger context of evangelical musings on the supernaturally evil by taking a closer look at the company that published it. So The Devil's Web was published in 1989 by a group called Huntington House, Inc., which is a Louisiana-based specialty press that catered to a very specific audience. Evangelical Christians with an interest in fringe conspiracy theories. Like, it's no accident the way this book is made and who makes it. So here's a selected list of the titles that Huntington House offered around the same time they put out Pulling's book.
Okay, a question before did they do Don't Make Me Go Back, Mommy?
Oh, yeah, you told me about. I don't think they did.
Okay. Shall we explain that one?
Do you want to?
Well, I don't have it right in front of me, but basically, okay, it's a picture book, a book intended for children about the satanic panic, about, Matt, what you were talking about with the conspiracy of children's like daycare services where...
Yeah, the daycare issues, yeah.
Yeah. About a little girl who was subjected to such things, and they were able to coax the truth out of her, and she doesn't have to go back to the bad place. It's since been regarded as propaganda. Kevin, I recently just came across this and found a copy, and you read it, I believe, right?
Yeah, it's basically is playing off the McMartin preschool scandal stuff.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it was also fully published at one point, like as a children's book and distributed as a kid's book in like libraries and schools and such.
Yeah, it was published in 1990. It was not published by Huntington House. It was published by a Portland-based publisher called Multnomah. I don't know if I pronounced it right, Multnomah Press. And was basically like, here are the signs that your child might have been ritualistically sexually abused. Again, it's basically capitalizing on McMartin. So going back to Huntington House, here are the kinds of books that they published around the same time as The Devil's Web was published in 89. There's Constance Cumby's, one of several funny names we're going to see. Constance Cumby's Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow, the New Age Movement in Our Coming Age of Barbarism from 1983. Jacob Aranza's Backward Masking Unmasked, Backward Satanic Messages of Rock and Roll Exposed from 1984. Another funny name, Winky Pratney. So Winky Pratney's Devil Take the Youngest, The War on Childhood from 1985. James D. Shaw and Tom C. McKenney's The Deadly Deception, Freemasonry Exposed by One of Its Top Leaders from 1988. And last in this vein, although I could have gone through a lot of books like this, there's the book by David Weber and N.W. Hutchins from 1986 called Computers and the Beast of Revelation. And I found a copy on eBay, and the back cover is priceless. So I'm going to put this in the chat. Maybe, Matt, if you want to read this one.
For centuries, Bible scholars have wondered how Revelation 13 could ever be fulfilled. When would some kind of image or machine speak and command everyone in the world to work or buy and sell with code marks and numbers? Today, we see signs all around us where computers are merging all of our economic transactions into a single, all-knowledgeable system. On an international basis, the computers are merging all nations into a single economic system. It is the purpose of this book to share with you information about computer control, computer networks, computer spies, the ultimate computer, and other subjects, all in light of Bible prophecy. It is our desire to awaken you to that which is predicated by Daniel, John in the Revelation, and even by our Lord in his discourse at Mount Olivier, the arrival of the great age of information and this explosion of knowledge.
Demonic computers are going to cause the one world government, as predicted in Revelation.
Working with computers for so long, why do they still defy me?
So this is all my way of saying why I'm not going to go into any significant detail debunking the Devil's Web. It's a fool's errand. It's not worth your time, just because it's a hodgepodge of wild, unsubstantiated assertions of satanic activity and ritual abuse interspersed with Pat pointing at random acts of violence and saying there's a demonic pattern while making no effort to support that in any meaningful way, largely because she is preaching to an audience that is even less intellectually curious than she is, who doesn't need convincing the devil is real and actively seducing our children. It was a conspiracy book written for conspiracy-minded people. All right, this has been a really fun conversation, and what we're going to do is we're going to take this up again next time as we go over another group of actors with which Pat Pulling's message of, the demonic dangers of Dungeons and Dragons resonated with. And we'll start addressing some of the groups that took issue with Pat Pulling's assertions about tabletop role-playing games. But in the meantime, I encourage you to check out Gathering of Gamers, Matt Shoemaker's new book by Play Story Press, and I'll include a link in the description. And that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and the sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam Sequi by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive, used under a CC BY NC SA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizzeri.
I'm Kate.
I'm Phil.
And I'm Matt.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next Scandal. Subscribe to Fat Roll Gaming on YouTube and listen to So We Were Talking About Beast Wars wherever you get your podcasts.